Hello, welcome to Baltic World. My name is Crispin. As you can see, temporary settings again today. Hopefully you can endure it for the next few weeks until we set up a permanent studio. For now, I want to give you an important update on Ukraine. I know in the last few days there were news reports proliferating mostly out of Russia that troops were being drawn down, exercises in Crimea were ending, and that perhaps there was never an intention to invade Ukraine in the first place. The Americans never bought this line. And in fact, today, President Biden became definitive and unequivocal. He said that President Putin has made the decision to invade Ukraine in the next week, likely in the next few days. What is President Putin's objective? It's like I said in previous videos, it seems to be the total decapitation of the Ukrainian government, the capture of Kyiv, and regime change to a pro-Russian government in Ukraine, much like we see in Belarus. Now, how can we be fairly sure at this point that this is going to happen? Well, just since the 20th of January, remember the build-up has been going on for a long time, but since the 20th of January, a few weeks ago, the number of troops that the Americans have detected around the border region of Ukraine has gone up from around 127,000 Russian troops to somewhere between 170 and 200,000 troops. This is a massive acceleration of buildup, and the Russian government has been building medical facilities, field hospitals. They've brought in doctors, nurses, plasma, all kinds of things that you could not dream of allocating. These are serious resources unless you were planning to invade. This cannot reasonably be a bluff at this point. Now, one of the biggest arguments against a Russian invasion of Ukraine was that President Putin hadn't laid the groundwork for the Russian people. The Russian people themselves have no appetite for invading Ukraine and fighting fellow Slavs. They might detest the Ukrainian government, but they see the shared links of culture, language, history with the Ukrainian people. Well, that is being changed rapidly. The latest news reports in Russia are about a massive escalation, reportedly by the Ukrainian government, against the Russian-speaking areas of eastern Ukraine. President Putin has come out and called it ethnic cleansing and genocide, i.e. claiming that the Russian minority in eastern Ukraine are being purged and killed en masse by a new Ukrainian offensive. Now, one of the great bugbears of the Russian people is the fear and anxiety of the treatment of Russian-speaking minorities in other parts of the world. The Russian government sees its kind of role to protect and preserve and take sovereignty over all Russian-speaking minorities wherever they are. That's one of the great reasons why Latvia and Estonia have anxieties about the Russian minorities within their own countries, as they fear separatist movements emerging. Well, a little bit different in places like Estonia than Ukraine. The big difference is the standard of living. So while you do have large numbers of people in the Baltic who are native Russian speakers, who might be pro-Russia in a political sense, well, they don't want to separate from their own countries and join Russia because the standard of living in Estonia and Latvia is a lot higher than for the average Russian person. But that is not the case in Ukraine. And in Ukraine, the conflict has been going on, obviously, for many years since the annexation of Crimea. So what we're seeing now in wall-to-wall media coverage in the Russian press is images of hundreds of thousands of women and children and older people being loaded up onto buses, fleeing eastern Ukraine to the relative safety of Russia ahead of this brutal Ukrainian onslaught, so-called. Now, there is no evidence of a Ukrainian offensive. Indeed, the Ukrainian government has equivocally said that no such offensive is on the cards. And therefore, it seems at this point that everything the Americans are saying is correct. What we've also seen in the last 48 hours is a dramatic increase in the artillery shelling coming across the border into Ukraine and from the occupied areas in eastern Ukraine, with the obvious intention of trying to provoke a reaction, i.e. Russia does something aggressive, the Ukrainians act to defend themselves, and that retaliatory defensive action is then what's broadcast in Russia as proof of aggression on the part of Ukraine. Thus far, the Ukrainian government has wisely maintained strict rules of engagement to prevent Russia from having footage broadcast around the world and domestically of Ukrainian aggression, giving Russia this casus belli, this false flag attack, claiming that there is ethnic cleansing and genocide going on. Of course, there is no evidence of that. It is not happening. And yet the Russian government can use this excuse not only to invade, but to motivate the troops and build up domestic support at home, the need for this conflict. Whereas what Russia really wants is to make sure that Ukraine never drifts to the Western sphere of influence, that NATO can never expand to include Ukraine, and that we have a Russian-backed, pro-Russia government in Ukraine that will do Russia's bidding, much like Lukashenko in Belarus. Now, there are some last-minute diplomatic efforts going on. A planned meeting between Foreign Minister Lavrov and Secretary of State Blinken. Open question whether we'll even get that far before an invasion occurs, and therefore, if it does happen, it'll all be off the table. We know that the Europeans have already balked at cutting Russia off from the SWIFT system, although gas won't be flowing through the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. If Russia is successful in its military campaign in Ukraine, Nord Stream 2 won't be necessary for the foreseeable future, because one of the reasons why the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was built was so that gas didn't have to flow through Ukraine. You didn't have that vulnerability. But if you have a pro-Russian puppet government in Ukraine, then that vulnerability is taken away from Russia's point of view. Obviously, there is a significant dependence on energy coming out of Russia. Global energy prices are already under significant strain. They will increase dramatically if an invasion occurs, meaning that the governments of Europe will be very reluctant to put in serious sanctions in response to Russia's aggressive action. Like in the last video, what will happen is an increased military presence in the eastern part of NATO, in the Baltic countries. Thousands of US troops will go in there. I suspect the Brits will build permanent bases in that region. And that will create a new fault line between Russia and the rest of the European countries on that NATO periphery. Other evidence as to timing, well, Zelensky is due to be out of the country in Munich. That's an ideal moment for Russia to invade. Not only does this hamper attempts to defend Ukraine and coordinate a top-level response, but with the government already absent, it means overthrowing the Zelensky government in Kyiv and instituting a new puppet regime, which is the ultimate strategic goal of Russia, becomes a lot easier. President Biden did kind of hint that maybe Zelensky should not leave the Ukraine, even though it would be safer for him at that particular time, because American intelligence seems to indicate that that is when Russia is planning to invade. Other evidence is that the Russian government have renewed demands that the Americans have already rejected. In fact, the Russian government said that they insist that the Americans withdraw all troops from Eastern and Central Europe, pulling back their forces to the 1997 demarcation before NATO expanded to include the Baltic countries. This, of course, is untenable for the United States. So putting aside the question of whether or not Ukraine can or cannot join NATO, the demands from the Russian government are so far beyond the pale that no American administration, no NATO alliance could possibly contemplate giving in to Russia's demands, meaning that Russia can now claim to be the aggrieved party, that it had reasonable security concerns, it tried every avenue of diplomacy, and therefore military action is the only thing that is now possible. I think the phrase that Putin used in the last 24 hours was technical military solutions. And one more critical bit of information that I don't think is talked about enough is the fact that basically all the pro-Russian members of the Ukrainian parliament have left Ukraine. Zelensky demanded they return within 24 hours or basically be branded as traitors. That period of time has already elapsed. They would not leave the country if they didn't expect a Russian invasion. And this makes perfect sense from a timing point of view as well, because critical to the success of Russian military operations will be whether there are uprisings in Ukraine's major cities. Obviously in the eastern areas around Kharkov, but also in Kyiv itself. Right now, there'll be Russian operatives supplying arms and equipment to underground cells within Kyiv with the idea of making it seem like Kyiv was defecting as an entire city to the oncoming Russian armed forces, welcoming them as liberators and hamstringing any kind of defense of the city. If the 2.8 million people who live there are not cooperative, they fight tooth and nail to defend their city, then the Russian invasion will grind to a halt and fail. Meanwhile, the horrors of war, the visual images of what transpires, the civilians who suffer, well, that will be broadcast around the world, hardening the resolve of the Western countries, which at the moment is quite fractured. They say that, they're all on the same page, they all condemn Russia. Well, they do, but the levels of cost and risk they're willing to go to resist Russia or to punish Russia should Russia invade Ukraine is wildly different. And if the humanitarian situation in Ukraine deteriorates significantly, if the war turns into a bloody quagmire, if this isn't all over in a period of weeks, which what no doubt Putin is hoping for, well, then the probability of Russia ultimately losing becomes that much greater. And the consequences for Russia of losing would be immense. Ukraine would almost certainly join NATO and have a pro-Western, anti-Russian bulwark on thousands of kilometers of Russia's western periphery. Quick final thoughts. I'm deeply heartbroken by what is likely to unfold here. I think that there is something wrong, unnatural with Slavs going to war with one another in this way. I said in the last video that this is as much a civil conflict as it is between nation states. There are so many people who have family on both sides of this argument, and therefore it could just be a terrible tragedy. Now I'll try and get as close to it as possible and report as often as I can. In the meantime, if you find value in this discussion, please do like and subscribe, hit the bell button, and leave your comments down below. The engagement helps the channel, gets it to more people, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.